There is one object sitting at the center of the Nolan Wells investigation that may contain more information than anyone realizes: Nolan's phone. It is small enough to fit in a pocket, easy to overlook among everything else investigators collect. Yet, according to the available reporting, questions remain about whether the device has actually undergone a full forensic examination. And that raises a simple question that has been difficult to ignore. If Nolan's phone has not been fully examined, what might still be sitting inside it? Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for being here. If you enjoy following these cases with us, make sure you're subscribed, because we'll continue following the developments as they unfold. The phone matters because modern phones do far more than make calls. They record movements, preserve conversations, store photographs, track locations, connect people through social media, and quietly create records of what happened throughout the day. Even when someone believes a message or photograph has been deleted, traces of that activity may sometimes remain. That does not mean Nolan's phone necessarily contains a hidden answer. It does mean the device could potentially help investigators reconstruct parts of his final days and hours, depending on what information remains available and whether investigators are able to obtain it. And that distinction is important. The exact details surrounding the phone's handling have not all been made public. So there is a difference between saying that the phone has not been examined and saying that investigators have done absolutely nothing with it. The available discussion points to questions about whether a complete forensic extraction has taken place, and those questions have become increasingly important because of what digital evidence can sometimes reveal. Imagine the phone sitting on a table in an evidence room. The screen is dark. The device looks ordinary. There may be fingerprints, photographs, text messages, application data, location records, and other information stored inside. But investigators cannot simply assume that everything visible on the screen represents everything the phone knows. A digital forensic examination can go much deeper. According to the expert discussion surrounding the case, specialists may be able to examine the phone's file system and look for information that is not immediately visible to an ordinary user. That can include deleted material, application records, notification histories, and other remnants left behind as the device is used. That becomes especially interesting when investigators are trying to establish a timeline. Suppose someone sends a message at 8:17 in the evening. Another message is received at 8:21. A photograph is taken several minutes later. The phone connects to a particular network or records location information afterward. None of those individual details may solve a case by themselves. Together, however, they can help build a sequence. And in an investigation where the timeline is important, sequence matters enormously. One of the questions surrounding Nolan Wells is what his phone could show about the people he communicated with and the places connected to the period being investigated. Messages could potentially establish who was speaking with him. Call records could show who contacted him. Application data could provide another indication of activity. Location information, if available and properly interpreted, might help investigators understand where the device was. There is also the issue of deleted messages. Many people assume that once a message disappears from a phone screen, it is gone forever. Digital forensics is not always that simple. Depending on the device, operating system, application, backups, and how the data was deleted, remnants of information may sometimes remain. That does not guarantee that investigators would recover Nolan's deleted messages. It simply means the possibility can be worth investigating. And one application mentioned in connection with the case makes that question even more complicated: Snapchat. Unlike a traditional text message conversation, Snapchat is designed around disappearing content. That can make the digital trail more difficult to understand. But disappearing from the screen is not necessarily the same thing as leaving no trace anywhere on a device or associated account. A forensic examiner would have to determine what data exists, what can legally be accessed, and what can actually be recovered. There is another piece of the puzzle too: location information. Phones can generate location-related records in several different ways. Some come from GPS. Others can be associated with cellular networks, Wi-Fi connections, applications, or other services. The reliability and precision can vary, so investigators would need to interpret the information carefully rather than treating every location point as an exact statement of where Nolan was standing. Still, if a reliable digital timeline could be established, it could potentially answer very basic questions. Where was the phone? When was it active? Who was communicating with Nolan? What applications were being used? Were there messages that appeared to have been deleted? And perhaps most importantly, does the digital record support or contradict the timeline investigators already have? That last question may be the reason the phone issue has attracted so much attention. A phone cannot tell investigators everything. It cannot explain a person's thoughts, and it cannot automatically prove what happened. But it can sometimes provide timestamps and records that are difficult to reconstruct from human memory alone. For a case surrounded by unanswered questions, that makes the device more than just a personal possession. It could be a timeline, it could be a record of communication, and potentially, it could contain clues that are no longer visible to the person who originally created them. But there is still a critical question hanging over all of this. Why has the phone apparently remained such a point of uncertainty? And what would a full forensic examination actually involve? That is where the investigation begins to get even more complicated. The question about Nolan's phone becomes more important when you consider what investigators are actually looking for during a forensic examination. It is not simply a matter of turning the phone on, scrolling through a few messages, and seeing what appears on the screen. A proper examination can involve creating a forensic copy of the available data and examining information that an ordinary user would never see. That distinction matters because the most important clue may not be sitting in an obvious text message. It could be buried in a timestamp. It could be connected to an application. It could be a deleted conversation that left behind a trace. Or it could be something as ordinary as a photograph, whose metadata helps establish when or where it was created. According to the expert discussion surrounding the investigation, digital examiners can sometimes recover information from areas of a device that are not visible through normal use. But recovery is never guaranteed. The type of phone, its operating system, encryption, security settings, backups, and what happened to the device after the information was deleted can all affect what investigators are able to retrieve. That means there are really two separate questions. First, what information was ever stored on Nolan's phone? And second, what information can still be recovered today? Those are not necessarily the same thing. Consider the messages again. If Nolan communicated with someone shortly before the events being investigated, the timing of those conversations could be significant. A message sent at one point might establish contact. A response could show that the conversation continued. A sudden stop in communication could provide another timestamp for investigators to compare against other evidence. But investigators would also have to be careful. A missing message does not automatically mean something suspicious happened. People delete messages for ordinary reasons. Applications can remove content automatically. Phones can synchronize with other devices. Data can disappear because of software settings rather than deliberate action. This is why forensic examination is generally about patterns rather than one isolated clue. The same principle applies to Snapchat. If Nolan was using the application, investigators might want to know whether relevant account or device information remains available. But disappearing content presents obvious challenges. The fact that something is no longer visible inside the application does not tell investigators exactly why it disappeared or whether any associated information remains elsewhere. That is where a specialist becomes important. Someone looking at the phone casually might see an empty conversation and conclude there is nothing there. A forensic examiner would ask a different question. What records exist behind what is visible to the user? And then there is the question of location. A phone's location history can sound like a perfect map of someone's movements, but real digital location data is more complicated than that. Different systems can provide different levels of accuracy, and a location associated with a phone does not necessarily prove that a particular person was physically holding the device at that exact moment. Still, when several forms of evidence line up, location information can become powerful. Imagine that a message is sent from Nolan's phone at a particular time. Around the same period, the device records a location. A photograph appears shortly afterward. Then there is another communication. If those pieces can be independently verified, investigators may be able to build a much clearer timeline. Now imagine the opposite. Suppose the digital record appears to place the phone somewhere that conflicts with another part of the investigation. That would not automatically prove that someone lied, but it would create a question that investigators would have to resolve. This is why the phone could potentially be so important. It is not necessarily about finding one dramatic message that suddenly explains everything. It is about comparing the digital record with the evidence investigators already have. There is also another concern: the phones of other people connected to Nolan. If investigators are trying to reconstruct communication and movement, Nolan's device may only be one part of the picture. Messages sent to him, calls made to him, and location information from other relevant devices could potentially help establish whether different accounts of events are consistent. That can become particularly important when witnesses remember events differently. Human memory is imperfect. Someone might genuinely remember receiving a message in the evening when the digital record shows it arrived earlier. Someone may remember being in one location while another record places their phone somewhere else. Neither discrepancy automatically proves deception, but discrepancies deserve explanation. And this is where the investigation can move from a simple question about a missing phone examination to a much broader question about the entire timeline. If the phone is eventually examined, investigators may not find the dramatic evidence people are expecting. They may find ordinary conversations. They may find routine photographs. They may find nothing useful. That possibility has to remain on the table. But if investigators do find something significant, the value could come from how that information connects with everything else. A message could confirm a witness account. A timestamp could challenge it. A location record could narrow down a period that investigators previously understood only generally. A deleted file could reveal that something existed on the device, even if its contents cannot be fully recovered. And a pattern of communication could help establish who Nolan was interacting with before the events under investigation. There is another reason the timing of the examination matters. Digital evidence can become harder to interpret as time passes. Devices are updated, accounts synchronize, data can be overwritten, cloud services change, applications change the way information is stored. That does not mean useful evidence automatically disappears, but it does mean investigators dealing with digital evidence generally have to think carefully about preservation. So when people ask why Nolan's phone has not simply been examined, the answer may be more complicated than it appears from the outside. There may be legal considerations. There may be technical limitations. There may be questions about who controls the device or the relevant accounts. And there may be information about the investigation that authorities have not publicly released. That last point is important. The public may not know everything investigators have already done. A lack of public information is not proof that nothing has happened behind the scenes. But it is also reasonable for people following the case to ask why such a potentially valuable source of evidence remains surrounded by uncertainty. Because eventually, the question comes back to the same place. If Nolan's phone contains even a small piece of the timeline, investigators need to know what that piece says. And if the phone contradicts something investigators already believe, that could be just as important as a confirmation. The deeper question, then, is no longer simply whether Nolan's phone was examined. It is what the phone could tell investigators that no witness, photograph, or public statement can tell them with the same precision. And that is where the next part of the story becomes especially important. At this point, the biggest question surrounding Nolan Wells's phone is no longer whether it could contain useful information. The more important question is whether investigators will finally get the opportunity to examine it thoroughly and compare what they find with the rest of the evidence. According to the information available in the case, Nolan's family and investigators had agreed to a joint examination of the phone. The family later proposed several dates for the examination, with their experts prepared to participate alongside state investigators and potentially the FBI. That arrangement matters because the family has reportedly wanted its own experts present during the process, rather than simply turning the device over and waiting for the results. And if the examination goes ahead, investigators have several important questions they could try to answer. Who was Nolan communicating with before he disappeared? What messages were sent? Were any messages deleted? What does the call history show? Was there social media activity that could help establish the timeline? And where was the phone during the critical period? Digital forensic expert Jake Green explained that reconstructing the timeline would be one of the most important uses of the phone. Social media, text messages, and call logs could all potentially contribute to that reconstruction. But there is something else worth remembering. A forensic examination may not produce the dramatic discovery that people expect. It might reveal ordinary conversations. It might confirm information investigators already know. It might recover something that helps explain a small part of the timeline. Or it might leave some of the biggest questions unanswered. That uncertainty is important. The phone should not be treated as though it is guaranteed to contain the answer to Nolan's death. But if it has not yet been fully examined, investigators cannot know what it can tell them until they actually look. And the longer the investigation continues, the more valuable a carefully preserved digital record could become. That is because the phone may provide something witnesses cannot always provide. Timestamps. People can remember events differently. Someone may remember a conversation happening before another event when the digital record suggests the order was different. Someone may remember seeing Nolan in one place when another piece of evidence points somewhere else. Those differences do not automatically mean someone is lying, but they can give investigators something concrete to investigate. That is why the phone could become particularly important when compared with the official timeline. There is also the question of Nolan's friends' phones. According to Green, law enforcement could potentially obtain a search warrant for another device if investigators identified it as relevant. But he also warned that continued use of a device or trading it in could affect what information remains available. So the investigation is not really about one phone alone. It is about whether investigators can reconstruct the digital trail surrounding Nolan during the period that matters most. Then there is the grand jury. The source material says a grand jury investigation was expected, while the official autopsy results remained sealed. A private autopsy arranged by the family had reportedly been inconclusive. For viewers following the case, that secrecy can make the situation feel as though nothing is happening. But that is not necessarily what it means. Judge Tarika Nunes Navarro explained that grand jury proceedings are normally secret. The secrecy is intended to protect witnesses and people who may be accused while allowing investigators and prosecutors to present evidence without exposing every detail publicly. That means Some of the information people are waiting for may simply not be public yet. And perhaps that is why the phone issue deserves so much attention. If the phone examination happens, its findings could potentially be considered alongside the autopsy, witness statements, physical evidence, and other digital records. The strength of the evidence may not come from one spectacular discovery. It could come from several smaller pieces agreeing with one another. A timestamp here, a message there, a call record, a location record, a photograph, a conversation that helps explain what happened during a particular hour. Piece by piece, those details could help investigators understand Nolan's final movements. But if the records point in different directions, that could be important too. The available information does not tell us what the examination will ultimately reveal. It also does not establish that Nolan's phone contains evidence of wrongdoing. Those are questions that can only be answered by examining the evidence itself. What we do know is that Nolan was 18 years old when he disappeared after a 4th of July celebration on Horn Island, off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. His body was found along the shoreline 2 days later, and the circumstances surrounding his death have remained unresolved in the information available to the public. His phone is therefore more than a piece of technology. It may be one of the few objects capable of helping investigators reconstruct the moments surrounding his disappearance. And now, after all the waiting, the attention is focused on whether the proposed joint forensic examination will actually take place and what investigators will discover when it does. Until then, there is one question that remains at the heart of this case. What happened during Nolan Wells' final hours? And could his phone finally help fill in the missing pieces? We may not have that answer yet. But if the phone is properly examined, investigators could finally have another opportunity to test the timeline, compare the digital evidence with witness accounts, and determine whether the device contains information that has been missed. For Nolan's family, that may be the most important thing of all. Not speculation, not rumors, but answers, supported by evidence. And as the investigation continues, the public will be watching to see whether those answers finally begin to emerge. What do you think investigators should look for first when Nolan's phone is examined? The messages, the location history, the call records, or something else? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep following this case as new information becomes available, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next update. Thank you for watching, and we'll be here to bring you the latest developments as this story continues.